I'm Julia Sate, retired FBI agent, criminal profiler, and former forensic scientist with the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation. When you've worked in behavioral analysis long enough, you learn to identify patterns, the way certain killers move, how they think, what triggers them. But in the case of Mark Twitchell, I wasn't looking at a pattern. I was staring into a singularity, a convergence of narcissism, fantasy, and fiction that had bled so deeply into reality that the line had all but disappeared. Twitchell didn't just imagine himself as a killer. He wrote the script, played the role, and built the set. It was theatrical homicide. Every decision was choreographed, every detail curated. The first failed attempt with Gilles Tetreault wasn't a misstep. It was a rehearsal. And the murder of Johnny Altinger wasn't just an act of violence. It was a production, directed and performed by a man who saw killing not as a crime, but as art. October 2008, Gilles Tetreault received an invitation to meet a woman named Sheena. She'd given detailed directions but no house number, guiding him instead to a nondescript garage. Gilles was cautious but curious. He walked in. Darkness. And then, chaos. He was struck, bound, and blinded. His attacker wore a painted hockey mask, holding what appeared to be a firearm. But instinct kicked in. Gilles tore off the tape and recognized something odd. The gun wasn't real. It was plastic. That realization gave him the edge. He fought back with everything he had, breaking free, rolling under the garage door, escaping just in time. Bruised and rattled, he chose silence. It wasn't shame, it was disbelief. How do you tell someone you were nearly killed by a masked man in a suburban garage? He convinced himself it was a robbery. But in truth, he had survived a killer's opening act. Exactly 1 week later, the script continued. Johnny Altinger, a mild-mannered tech enthusiast, set off for a date with a woman named Jen. He left detailed directions with a friend, a habit born of caution. When he didn't return, and when emails claimed he had suddenly gone to Costa Rica with a woman he'd just met, friends grew suspicious. His passport was untouched. His home was undisturbed. And his car was missing. Investigators used the directions Johnny had sent. They didn't lead to an apartment. They led to a garage. That garage belonged to Mark Twitchell. When confronted, Twitchell claimed it was simply a set for his new film project. The plot? A killer lures a man using a dating profile and murders him in a garage. The killer wears a hockey mask. The level of audacity was staggering. But Twitchell's confidence, his calm demeanor, gave investigators pause. Was he bold or was he delusional enough to think he could pull this off? Twitchell allowed police to inspect the garage. They found blood. He said it was corn syrup and food coloring. Movie effects. He maintained this was all a production, props, makeup, special effects. But his performance had cracks. He never mentioned the car, not until later. Then, in a bizarre twist, he claimed to have bought the red Mazda from a man in an alley. A stranger who said he was moving to Costa Rica. The price? $40. No paperwork, no witnesses. Just a handshake and a handshake agreement. It was a story so ridiculous it insulted the intelligence of the investigators. They knew they were being lied to. They just needed to prove it. That's when digital forensics came into play. When police searched Twitchell's laptop, they discovered a deleted document buried deep in the system, one he had tried to permanently erase. Its title, SK Confessions. SK, serial killer. It wasn't a script. It was a diary. Written in the first person, it chronicled every moment of the attack, from setting up the date to killing the victim. It was written with cold detachment and surgical clarity. Lines like, "I plunged the knife deep into his neck." His reaction was pure Hollywood. Didn't sound like fiction. They sounded like memory. This wasn't speculative writing. It was documentation. And now, it was evidence. Each line of SK Confessions aligned with reality. The timeline. The method. Even the language used in Johnny's fake departure emails was paraphrased from the diary. Police were now certain Twitchell had used his own writing to rehearse, record, and relive the crime. But he wasn't alone in knowing what had happened. A woman in Ohio named Renee had been corresponding with Twitchell online. They'd met in a Dexter fan forum. At first, their chats were benign. Then they turned dark. Twitchell began fantasizing aloud. They discussed methods of murder, disposal techniques, and eventually, he dropped the veil entirely. "I crossed the line," he told her. "I did something, and I liked it." Renee hadn't known whether to believe him. Was he role-playing? Seeking attention? Or was he confessing? She would later tell police that she sensed something terrible had happened. But at the time, she didn't realize she was talking to a man who had already killed and was preparing to do it again. When detectives uncovered their chat logs, the similarities to SK confessions were undeniable. The language, the pacing, the voice. Twitchell had been rehearsing through words, testing boundaries with others before crossing them in real life. In many ways, the crime didn't begin in the garage. It began in his imagination. And through digital trails, investigators followed that fantasy into real-world horror. The turning point came when forensic analysts found blood in the trunk of Twitchell's car. DNA confirmed it belonged to Johnny Altinger. The red Mazda Twitchell claimed to have purchased in a back alley was, in fact, the victim's. He had staged it all, from the online profile to the follow-up emails. He crafted the illusion of a man who had run away to paradise, while hiding the truth of a man butchered in a garage. His arrogance had left a trail. Every detail of his plan had been recorded. SK Confessions had even mentioned a plan B in case things went wrong. He hadn't just fantasized, he'd built contingencies. That level of preparation painted a chilling portrait. This was not impulsive. It was calculated. Yet, amid all the evidence, one thing remained missing: Johnny's body. Investigators combed sewer lines, ravines, and waste bins. Twitchell remained silent. Then, a year later, he cracked. He handed over a map, a crude drawing with an X marking a sewer near his parents' home. Inside, authorities found human remains. Dental records confirmed they belonged to Johnny Altinger. With that, the case became airtight. The confessions, the car, the garage, the remains. All roads led back to one man. Twitchell had written his fantasy in blood and pixels. Now it was time for justice. In 2011, Mark Twitchell stood trial for first-degree murder. He insisted on testifying. His defense? That it had all been a publicity stunt, a prank, a social experiment for his film. He claimed Johnny had become enraged and attacked him, that the death was self-defense. But the jury saw through it. The lies were too elaborate. The planning too thorough. This wasn't a stunt. It was a story come to life. After just 5 hours of deliberation, the jury returned a guilty verdict. Twitchell was sentenced to life in prison with no chance of parole for 25 years. But for those who knew Johnny, no sentence could undo what had been done. Behind bars, Twitchell remained true to form. He continued writing. He sent hundreds of pages to journalist Steve Lillibwood, who would later publish a book on the case. Twitchell spun theories, reimagined timelines, and justified his actions. He wasn't trying to win sympathy. He was trying to control the narrative. He wanted to be remembered not as a killer, but as a misunderstood artist. But his words betrayed him. "It is what it is, and I am what I am," he wrote. That was the real confession. A man who saw no wrong, who saw murder as a medium, and who still, even in prison, couldn't stop directing the show. The most haunting detail remains Gilles Tétrault, the one who got away. His account, almost identical to Johnny's fate, proved Twitchell had intended to kill before. Giles' escape wasn't just lucky, it was historic. Had he not fought back, there would have been more victims. Twitchell wasn't a one-time killer. He was an aspiring serial killer. SK Confessions wasn't a diary. It was Volume 1. The next name, the next method, was already taking shape. Giles' courage and survival changed the course of that story. and gave investigators the final piece they needed to understand what they were really dealing with. Not just a murderer, but a man trying to live a fantasy where fiction and blood became indistinguishable. The SK Confessions was more than just evidence. It was the psychological key to unlocking Mark Twitchell's mindset. The content wasn't only detailed, but framed with a disturbing detachment. Twitchell wrote about luring his victim through a fake dating profile, step by step, as if he were storyboarding a scene for a film. Every phrase dripped with intent. He meticulously mapped out how he created the illusion of a date, got the man into the garage, and subdued him with a stun baton. What followed was execution, dismemberment, and disposal, all captured in the language of a director describing a project. But this wasn't a film. It was real. And police knew that no person writes with this degree of detail unless it stems from lived experience. The challenge, then, was translating narrative into proof, something that could hold up in court and counter any claims that it was merely fictional writing. They needed more. Twitchell's digital footprint provided that. His email, social media messages, and deleted chats contained chilling parallels to SK Confessions. Investigators found messages where he referenced the cleanup process, where he vented about the stress of being under investigation, and where he slipped, unintentionally connecting himself to actions detailed in the diary. One of the most damning pieces came from a casual exchange with Renee, where he referenced doing something dark and liking it. This line mirrored SK Confessions, reinforcing its authenticity. Furthermore, metadata from the file showed when it had been written, which aligned with Johnny Altinger's disappearance. The diary wasn't a retrospective. It was a live account. Forensic analysts also confirmed that SK Confessions had been intentionally deleted. This mattered in court. It showed consciousness of guilt. Innocent writers don't bury their creative drafts with software meant to erase permanently. Yet the police had recovered it. That discovery shifted the tone of the investigation. Now, detectives weren't chasing a killer who had made a mistake. They were tracking a man who thought he'd executed the perfect crime and then edited his narrative accordingly. Twitchell considered himself smarter than everyone else, smarter than his victims, his wife, and especially the police. That arrogance became his Achilles heel. Meanwhile, police continued digging into Twitchell's private life. They found that his finances were built entirely on deception. He'd borrowed tens of thousands of dollars from family and friends, promising them film roles, production credits, and returns on investment. None of those promises materialized. Some of the people who gave him money were devastated, not just financially, but emotionally. They had believed in him. He betrayed their trust and used their money to rent the garage, purchase his disguise, and assemble his so-called kill kit. In other words, their support unwittingly funded a murder. Equally troubling was the discovery that Twitchell's personal relationships were just as fabricated. His marriage had become more of a living arrangement than a partnership. His wife was unaware of his double life. He told her he had work. In truth, he was unemployed, spending his days plotting, writing, and practicing. When investigators searched the home, they found masks, costumes, and scripts filled with disturbing scenarios, one of which mirrored the murder almost identically. Police concluded that his obsession with Dexter and murder had consumed him, replacing reality with fantasy. And in that fantasy, he cast himself as the star. When Twitchell arrested on Halloween, it wasn't lost on investigators how fitting the timing was. He had crafted a costume for that night, one meant to impress, to reflect his dark and theatrical persona. Instead, he was yanked from that narrative by reality. He urinated himself during the arrest, a raw, human reaction in stark contrast to the icy control he claimed to possess. That moment symbolized the fall of his fictional character. The director became the suspect. The predator became prey. But as with any murder case, finding the victim's body remained a priority. Without Johnny Altinger's remains, there would always be room for reasonable doubt. Investigators turned to the confession once more. Twitchell had written that he attempted to burn the remains but failed. Then he tried to dump them but feared getting caught. Ultimately, he decided to hide them in a sewer. Police combed through manholes and sewer systems across Edmonton, but with no clear marker. It was like looking for a needle in a labyrinth. Then, almost a year later, Twitchell folded. He gave them a map. That map led to a sewer near his parents' house, a place no one would think to look. When investigators opened it, they found remains. Dental analysis confirmed it was Johnny. This was the final piece. The narrative of SK Confessions now matched the timeline, the digital evidence, the online interactions, and the physical remains. Prosecutors now had a slam-dunk case, a body, a confession, and motive embedded in psychological obsession. Twitchell, for all his calculated planning, had failed to hide the truth. His desire to document his process had become his undoing. The trial began in 2011. Twitchell, ever the performer, took the stand. His story was audacious. He claimed that the entire event had been a marketing stunt for his horror movie. That Johnny was in on it. That things escalated and he was forced to kill in self-defense. It was a narrative only he believed. He claimed SK Confessions was merely a dramatized account meant to blur reality and fiction, a literary experiment gone wrong. But the jury didn't buy it. They saw through the theatrics. The evidence was overwhelming. In just 5 hours, they returned with a guilty verdict. Twitchell was sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole for 25 years, the maximum penalty under Canadian law. For many, it wasn't long enough. But justice had been served. The real story, however, continued behind bars. Twitchell wasn't done. He began corresponding with journalist Steve Lillibut, who had covered the trial. What began as a simple exchange turned into a series of over 350 pages of letters. In them, Twitchell tried to reframe the narrative, offering explanations and insights that only reinforced his narcissism. Lillibut later said the letters were both fascinating and disturbing. Twitchell wrote as if he were narrating a biography, carefully curating his tone, explaining away evidence, and always returning to the same line: he hadn't meant to kill. Yet he drew scenes of kill rooms, wrote essays about Dexter's moral structure, and described the emotional clarity he felt after the act. It was clear Twitchell didn't just want to be remembered. He wanted to be mythologized. His obsession with storytelling hadn't faded. He was still directing, only this time from a prison cell. One of the most telling lines came from a letter where he wrote, "It is what it is, and I am what I am." There's no remorse in that statement. No ambiguity. Just acceptance. Twitchell believed he was different. Special. Above the rules that govern everyone else. He likened himself to a misunderstood artist, someone punished for pushing boundaries. But there were no boundaries worth pushing here. Only a brutal murder, a life destroyed, and countless others forever scarred by the fallout. What Twitchell never understood was that he wasn't the hero of his story. He was the villain. The breakthrough moment in the investigation wasn't just the DNA or the map. It was Gilles Tétrault, the man who escaped. When police went public with details of the case, Tétrault recognized the hockey mask. It was the same one worn by his attacker. Until that point, Tétrault had believed his assault was a random mugging. He hadn't gone to police. He was embarrassed, confused, and trying to move on. But now, he realized how close he had come to death. He went to police and told his story. His account matched SK Confessions almost perfectly. The date set up, the garage, the tape over his eyes, the plastic weapon, the fight, the escape. All of it mirrored what Twitchell had written. Tétrault's survival proved one crucial point. Johnny's murder was not an accident. It was a second attempt. A perfected method. Twitchell had learned from his failure and tried again. And this time, he succeeded. That made him a serial killer in the making. Had Tétrault not fought back, there would have been more victims. Twitchell's fantasy didn't end with one kill. The confessions, the emails, the letters all pointed toward a mind in preparation. He viewed murder as a performance, a project to refine. The first time was messy, but he learned from it. Adapted. His desire wasn't just to kill. It was to orchestrate an experience. He wanted to write it, direct it, and star in it. He craved total control over life and death. That's why Dexter resonated so deeply. It wasn't just the violence, it was the craft, the illusion, the applause. Today, Twitchell remains in prison. He continues to write, and there are rumors of ongoing correspondence with true crime enthusiasts. That is perhaps the final tragedy. He wanted an audience, and in some dark corners of the internet, he still has one. But for those of us who study behavior, who've dedicated our lives to understanding the darkest parts of humanity, his story is a cautionary tale about obsession, about unchecked fantasy, and about the danger of mistaking fiction for purpose. Mark Twitchell was not a misunderstood artist. He was a man who used fiction as a license for murder.